Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Morgan. I am the adult programming librarian at the Newburgh Free Library. The theme for Black History Month this year is Black Health and Wellness, and tonight's presentation will focus on healing traditions and ancestral wisdom in Black history, particularly Hoodoo, rootworking, and other healing traditions. So we're very honored to have with us tonight Dr. Yvonne Chireau. Yvonne Chireau is a professor of religion at Swarthmore College, where she teaches courses on African American religions, Black women in religion, and new African religions. Dr. Chireau is the author of Black Magic, Religion, and the African American Conjuring Tradition. So I am going to turn things over to Dr. Yvonne Chireau. Just so everyone knows too, I mentioned before, but we are recording tonight's presentation, so it will be available to watch on Facebook and YouTube. Dr. Chireau?
Okay, good evening, thank you. So I'm in Swarthmore right now, which is about 30 minutes from Philadelphia, where the first library in the nation was established by Ben Franklin, the library company, which is still there. And it wasn't for about another 100 years that free libraries were established in the country. And municipal and county libraries followed that. Young, rich, poor, Black, white, these are spaces that are for all, and we don't take this for granted. So we really love the free library system. We appreciate the people who care for this beloved institution, which includes many volunteers. So I want to thank Christopher for inviting me. I want to encourage you to support the library. Libraries are one of the last places, right, that you would think are coming under any kind of political assault, but we even see this during Black History Month with reports of censorship and book banning. But we need access to books. We want the stories that they provide for us, and this is something we're grateful for. So I thank you for inviting me. So tonight I've been asked to talk about root doctors, hoodoo, and African-American folk medicine, and I have a lot to cover, so I may not get through it. I may zip through some parts. This includes a lot of information on what enslaved people did as part of their healing repertoire. And I'm not going to talk about the contemporary aspects so much. But I do want to take it in a little different direction. And it's a chance for us to do a little deeper thinking about our own histories in relation to this topic, and especially our family histories. So as a religion person, it strikes me that some of the former ways of doing things from hundreds of years ago are coming around again today. You see this even on the internet, where many of the old time practices have been documented and preserved and adopted by the younger generations. And I find this to be a beautiful circle of culture. I'm going to share my screen now. Make sure that I can pull this up. Okay, only host. Okay. Tell me if you can see this. Okay, right, we good? Okay. Okay. So I find this way of taking up these traditions again and again. Let me stop this thing. By the young people to be something of a beautiful circle of culture. And this idea of the circle of culture, I just want to talk about it a second. And I'm going to give a lot of book sources. You can copy them down if you want to get in touch with me later at my website, academichoodoo.com. I'm really, really into the sharing of a lot of this information. But the idea of this circle of culture. In 1968, the late Black Studies scholar Sterling Stuckey said, and this is an essay that he called Through the Prism of Folklore. And he said, what enslaved African-American people had learned about handling misfortune was not only a major factor in their survival, but many of the lessons learned and aesthetic standards that were established would be used by future generations in coping with a hostile world. Really, really prescient, right? Stuckey described African-American slave culture after the model of the circle or the ring shout, which was part of African-American enslaved religious worship, the ritual cosmology of the spiral. And he's arguing that the culture of enslaved African-American people encompassed responses to suffering, not only physical suffering and affliction, but forms of spirituality and creative practices that Black folk pursued for their own well-being. So he is placing a great emphasis on spirituality as a source of personal and collective agency. So tonight, I want you to consider the prospect that notions of health and sickness are also spiritual concepts, or if you will, religious concepts. And this is the idea that the individual's health and well-being is both personal and it is social. And in this way of thinking, healing is something that is balanced against the presence of disease, misfortune, evil, and affliction. And it's this idea that there are things that support human flourishing, right, in this world. Things like culture, community, family, plants and animals, the sacred and ritual practices that are available for us. So for Black folk, many of these afflictions also included afflictions of the body, of the social body. So let me start with some terms. Hoodoo is the name that's been applied to a broad system of practice associated with Black American folk magic in the 19th century, and that's a mouthful. We're not sure where the term comes from. The Paiute Indians in what is now Utah used it to refer to these spectacular, these red geological formations. They called them hoodoos. And the Indian myths and stories tell us that these were once ancient people. These are like colossal people and spirit beings who turned to stone. And these are in these sacred supernatural spaces. And you can see these hoodoos throughout the Southwest, not only in Utah, but in the Great Plains in Colorado. On the other hand, in the colonial era, Anglo sailors used the term hoodoo to describe ships that had been attacked by unexpected storms, that had been cursed at sea. It became part of the maritime vernacular. So I also wonder about slave ships, but hoodoo in this sense is used to talk about the misfortune of the ship. And there are also called hoodoo ships. And then in African-speaking populations, in Hausa speakers in particular, the term huduba meant to arouse resentment or retribution. And there were, of course, many Hausa speakers in the enslaved Black community. Many of them were literate Arabic Muslims. So you see this term hoodoo is sort of a mixed bag. And this is where the fun comes in solving these kinds of questions. They become a great riddle. But hoodoo today is used as an umbrella term to describe African-American practices of metaphysical healing, protection, and ancestral devotion. It consists of ideas and actions that are utilized for purposes of healing and well-being, but also acts of retaliation and aggression. And that is to say that hoodoo was believed to both cure affliction, but also cause it. It can heal and it can harm. And I want to talk about this later. The word rootworking refers specifically to the use of certain natural and organic objects, herbs, plants, elements, and this is in the performance of actions, whether healings or again, poisonings and so forth. Conjure and conjuring refers to interactions with spiritual beings, angels, saints, the dead and the ancestors, as well as the Christian God. And again, in order to heal and sometimes cause harm. Of course, there are cursing practices in most religions that may or may not be authorized. And then there's the term voodoo. And I crossed this out because those of us who study this don't really use this word. And it's sort of a junk category that refers to an imagined racial and religious otherness. It has nothing to do with hoodoo. It's disparaging. It's not really useful in this context, but we can talk about this too at the end. The idea of voodoo comes out of the West African context, as well as Haiti, when the word was first used by outsiders to refer to enslaved Black people back in the colonial era. So it's a very derogatory term, and it has a history of misrepresentation. But the first three terms refer to healing, medicine, and self-protection. This, in the context of slavery, takes special resonance. So practitioners of these traditions were known by many names: root workers, conjurers, two-head doctors. You have male conjure people, female conjure people, female spirit workers. Very, very, very diverse tradition because it's geographically specific. Right now, I want you to sort of reach back and consider your own ancestors, all right? What kinds of healing and curing systems were available to them? What kinds of ideas about health? How did they deal with physical and mental affliction? And in your mind's eye, as you think about your great-great-great-great-grandparents and the world in which they lived in. You'll come up with different ideas, different pictures, different ways of dealing with healing. We call this therapeutic pluralism, therapeutic pluralism. I want to take you back to an earlier period in American history. And I want to show you the only document that we have of someone named Dr. Long Hercules. And this is hard to read, I know. This is from the 1700s, so I'll read it for you. It says, run away from the subscriber on or about the 12th ultimo. Ultimo means last month. The following Negro, Long Hercules, otherwise called Dr. Hercules, for his remarkable conjurations of pigs' feet, rattlesnakes, from the legs of several sick people, many of whom believe him to have performed miracles. So this is from Savannah, Georgia, 1786. Georgia hasn't even joined the Union yet, so this is pretty early. There's not really a United States to speak of. The international slave trade is still going strong, and it will for another 20 years. And the war for independence is 75 years ahead. But I want you to think about this man. And this is the context. This is an advertisement for a runaway slave, Dr. Long Hercules. Imagine 240 years ago, this was the kind of document that was very common in the newspapers. As for Hercules, this is all we know about him, all right? He may have been a priest in his country of origin. He's referred here as an African. He is called Hercules in the way that a lot of slave owners gave bogus Greek names to African people instead of their own names. He was also called Doctor, which is very significant to me. And according to the notice, he possessed great powers and performed remarkable conjurations on behalf of sick people. Okay, the advertisement here also refers to removing live animals and animal parts from the human body. And this is a treatment that's very similar to that documented among Native American shamans, as well as Pentecostal faith healers even today. Okay, I think that Hercules might have been a vital healthcare provider to other enslaved people, as well as freed people in Savannah, Georgia. He might have been a ritual specialist. He might have been someone who drew from various techniques. Other than this newspaper notice, little is known about the life and the death of this man who left behind a wife in bondage on the Georgia plantation. He's a fugitive, right? So like so many Black people at this time, Africans and African Americans, he is subordinated by an economic and social order that endorsed the ownership of human bodies by other people. Something to think about as we think about bodies, affliction, and health. What does it mean not to own your body or to be told by the law that your body is not yours? What we do know is that Hercules was probably not, Long Hercules was not unique. There were other enslaved persons who fit a similar profile. And these are some of the names that were given to these people. One of the issues that I have is that it's really hard to find these folks in slavery era documents. So we have good histories of what slavery is like, but the practices of healing and spirituality really seem to be shrouded in mystery. Sometimes the closest references that we have come from things like art and fiction. So these are some of the names that appear in some of the documents from the slavery era. And this is some of the history and fiction. Charles Chestnut, you may know his work. He wrote one of the first books about the conjure woman. It's called, and again, you can probably find all of this in your library. The other image is from one of the films you might know, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, an image of a real South Carolina root worker. What we do know about Hoodoo, conjure, and root working practitioners is that they were considered to be different and apart from others. Some were called sorcerers. Some were known to use ritual actions to cure different afflictions. Many were seen as having particular abilities and knowledge, and they were often described as having some distinguishing feature. Some of them were birthed with a caul. The caul is the amniotic veil that covers the face of a newborn. And the folk beliefs say that children who are born with this have the gift of enhanced sight into the spiritual realm. Stories by formerly enslaved people tell of people who had some distinguishing characteristic. It could be a birthmark. It could be a bodily trait like a hair lip. It could be red eyes. These are seen as signs, physical signs of one's abilities or spiritual powers. And so they're usually very anomalous. Other anomalies include moles, eyes that are green for Black people, albinism, hunchbacks, and so forth. And Hoodoo practitioners also adopted emblems that signified their status. Sometimes they would wear dark glasses. This is a sign of second sight. Sometimes they would have exotic paraphernalia like snakes or snake skin around the shoulders. And most Hoodoos carried elaborately carved staffs. And we actually have some of these, or they own spirit helpers, animals. One of the favorite is the frizzle-headed chicken. And so, of course, we have a variety of descriptions of these people, again, more so in the fiction. But what does this tell us about African and African-American religion? I like to use religion as the interpretive framework in order to understand this. Why? I find that there's a strong bias against indigenous African practices. For so long, they were considered not as religions, but as witchcraft, okay? Or as voodoo, okay? For so long, they're not spoken of as sacred traditions. The reason that this is important is because onlookers, people who we rely on to tell the history of this material, they often characterized African religious life in negative terms. And if you think about it, primitivism, fetishism, witchcraft, devil worship, it goes on and on and on. A lot of these perceptions carried into the slavery era and beyond. So what you get is a kind of skewed perspective on African religions. And we really, really want to know more about African religions at this time because it's so important. And one of the reasons is that people who documented this interpreted the practices of African people as anything but religion. But if you look at Hoodoo, you'll see that it has many of the same things that religion has. It has authorities, adepts. There are no priests or ministers in Hoodoo per se, but there are practitioners who have a leading role in their communities, especially Black communities, enslaved Black communities. In fact, some have described Hoodoo practitioners as the other important spiritual functionaries in Black communities, other than Christian preachers. And here I want to quote W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's talking about the world of the slave after Africa in his book, Souls of Black Folk. And I highly recommend this book. He says, and I changed the wording so that it was, I changed the gender of the wording, but he says, after Africa, there were some traces that retained of the former life, and the chief remaining institution was the priest or the medicine man. He, I said she, appeared on the plantation and found his function as the healer of the sick, the interpreter of the unknown, the comforter of the sorrowing, the supernatural avenger of wrong, and the one who rudely but picturesquely expressed the longing, disappointment, and resentment of a stolen and oppressed people. This church, he says, was not at first by any means Christian, nor was it organized. Rather, it was an adaptation and mingling of heathen rites among the members of each plantation, roughly designated as voodooism. Now see here, I take exception to the language of voodooism. It's not a very precise term. It's something that was used very, very often in the 19th century. But Du Bois is speaking of something that Professor Albert Raboteau called the invisible institution, the invisible religious institution. This invisible institution is the birthplace of Hoodoo and Conjure. And this is where women's leadership really becomes apparent. And this is because women were chiefly responsible for healthcare in the domestic environment. Women tended to be the repositories of knowledge, I think, as they are today. They were the keepers of folk remedies, recipes, rituals, and medicines. And African-American women's slave traditions were also developed, were associated with female-specific healing practices. But another overlap that we see between Hoodoo and religion is that Hoodoo, like religion, had sacred texts. Now, most of the tradition was and remains oral and passed on, But you really see post-slavery, and this is a time when literacy really opened up for Black folk. You see certain books and sacred texts that were used by Hoodoo practitioners. Zora Neale Hurston, and I'll get to her in a second. Zora Neale Hurston, who was the anthropologist who really began to look closely at Hoodoo in America, she said that for Black folk, the Bible is the greatest conjure book in the world. Also, like religion, Hoodoo, as we know, in many religions, Hoodoo has materia that's provided by nature. Plants, leaves, vegetables, fruits for medicine and food. So there's a sacred medicine in this tradition with herbs, and God said it was good. So you find many of the same things that you find in religions across the world, you'll find in the Hoodoo conjure tradition, but it is not organized religion. It's something that attaches to organized religion. And you can find religious people who engaged in these practices in slavery, but there's no church of Hoodoo. There is a community, there's a hush arbor, which is the secret place where enslaved people went. There are public ceremonies and dances, but they may not be organized around Hoodoo, but there is a shared vision and a collective worldview. And because the traditions of African people who were brought to the New World were diverse, it cannot be said that there was one African religion. And this is a really, really important point. People came from all over the African continent. They passed through that Middle Passage. They became Africans instead of people of the nations and the ethnic groups that they were, all right? However, even with that great diversity, there are common symbols and values and traits, a common shared orientation of African people. And this is what I've identified, and others have talked about this too. When we think of healing, in the way that African folk thought of healing. This is an ethos that says that harmony or harmonious existence between living beings is the optimal state. Harmonious existence between living beings is the optimal state for all of us. That disruption of harmony is seen as failure to maintain some aspect of relationship between the human and the divine. It's a vision that extends beyond the visible and the material world. And so what I mean by this is that the notion of community for African people, particularly those who are drawn into this slave community, it's idealized, it's multidimensional. It encompasses human beings, divine beings, God Almighty, and most importantly, those who have passed away, but who remain loved and respected beyond the earthly realm. These are the ancestors, which later become tremendously important in the spiritual life of enslaved Black people. So when we begin to get to cases of healing and Hoodoo in the 1800s, it's important to note that there's lots of parallel things going on. Of course, Native American people, indigenous Indian people possessed effective and vital healing practices of botanical medicine and spiritual healing. And then among Anglo white populations as well, old world European practices and beliefs such as cunning make their way into the healing practices of ordinary people. And this is long before 19th century science, of course. So what you see are competing ideas. Sometimes Hoodoo, rootworking, and conjure intersect with the ethno-medical systems and spiritual beliefs of both Native Americans and Europeans. Okay, does that make sense? So at different points though, all of these would be demonized and misunderstood. A lot of the domestic healing arts of Anglo-Americans, of white people, would be considered a kind of quack medicine. For Native American and African people, their traditional practices would be seen as superstition and so forth. The bottom line is that this healing tradition was created by people who needed it. For enslaved African-American people, it could be protection against physical affliction as well. For the abused woman or the oppressed young man, this type of healing practice might have offered other possibilities for empowerment. And let me give you one famous example. This story comes from the autobiography of the extraordinary Black American abolitionist, statesman, and former fugitive slave, Frederick Douglass. So like Long Hercules, Frederick Douglass was a fugitive, a runaway. And Douglass lived in Maryland as a young man in the 1830s. And he tells the story in his autobiography. Again, a wonderful book. And this is a book that I think everyone should read. There's actually a new biography of Douglass that came out last year. But Douglass, he tells the story of how he tried to run away from the farm in which he lived and where he was enslaved. And for days he lives in the woods. He doesn't get very far. He's hungry, he's cold, he's tired. And then he says in his autobiography, he met in the woods someone that he called a genuine African conjurer. Sounds like long Hercules again, but it's about 100 years apart. A genuine African conjurer, and his name is Sandy Jenkins. And Douglass says, Jenkins had a religion for which I have no name. All right. So he's tired, he doesn't know what to do. And Sandy Jenkins, the conjurer, gives him a root. And we believe it was the High John root. High John is the root par excellence in Hoodoo tradition. And he said that if Douglass took this root, it would prevent any white man from beating him. And as you can understand, for enslaved young men, this was a huge problem. So Douglass, of course, he's skeptical, but having no other options, he takes the root and then he goes back to the home. And this is the fascinating part of the story. I took the root, he says, and according to Sandy's direction, I carried it in my pocket on my right side. On entering the yard, out came the slave driver. His name was Covey. Out came Covey on his way to Sunday meeting. He spoke to me very kindly. Now, Douglass had already been gone for a few days. They knew he had tried to run away. He spoke to me very kindly and went to church. Now, this conduct made me think that there was something in the root that Sandy gave me. Had it been any other day than Sunday, I would have attributed the conduct to no other cause than the influence of that root. So for those of you who know this narrative, you know that this is a turning point. And the very next day that he's attacked by this slave driver, Covey, who is notorious, and a notorious brutal slave breaker. At this time, though, when he attacks young Douglass, Frederick Douglass, he achieves a personal turning point. He defiantly fights back for the first time. He draws blood from his abuser. This was the moment, and Douglass writes this, that he says, the slave became a man. The root, still in his pocket, is something of a metaphor for manhood, right? But his act of resistance, even his skepticism about the power, he's describing something about the root. Was the power of the root from Hoodoo conjure, or was it his faith in the power of the thing? So there's lots of stories like this. Lots of stories like this come from the slavery period. And we continue to try to gather these stories because they tell us so much. But what happens after slavery? Because Hoodoo and conjure was so much a part, it's embedded in the social structure of slavery. Does it disappear after emancipation? Does it go away? No, what we end up having are traditions that have been maintained for hundreds of years. Some of them, some practitioners enduring under tremendous circumstances of persecution and repression. At a certain point, these Hoodoo practices were associated with poisoners. This was a huge problem in the South. So they were basically outlawed. They were illegal and so forth. So some of the practices of retaliation go underground, the healing practices as well. Even after emancipation though, and this is a time when Black people lack access to professional medicine and special health care, and the low cost and easily acquired formulations of these healers, they become an alternative. Black people had many reasons for seeking out their own healing practitioners. I'm going to quote some of the words from these former slaves because they are the best witnesses to this thing. Janie Hunter, who's the descendant of slaves in South Carolina, said, people couldn't afford doctors. They only had homemade medicines. Unless you got sure enough powerful sick, then you go see a root doctor. Other enslaved people tended to mistrust white physicians. Many of them were disinclined to sufficiently or fairly serve the needs of Black people. We know that then Black Black doctors often treated Black patients with contempt. So, and this very much reveals to us the deeply ingrained prejudices that had been fostered by racist ideologies in science and society. Other Black people, though, were dissuaded by frightening stories and lore about physical mutilation, theft of bodies, and medical experimentation. So there's a real avoidance of the medical system for a lot of good reasons. Black folk also lacked confidence in the invasive techniques of 19th century medicine and 20th century medical practice. Another enslaved person says, the root doctor was all we ever needed. And this is a Gullah slave in Georgia. They were better than the doctors that we have nowadays. Those doctors are always cutting and making you sick. The root doctor would give you some tea and something, an herb, and that's all. So as a consequence, we can begin to see why and how African Americans in slavery and then after slavery would utilize hoodoo healers, root doctors, and conjurers for their needs. Okay, this is a picture of Zora Neale Hurston. Generally, when I talk about this, people, they don't like the history part, but they're like, yeah, give me some recipes so I can do things. Hurston is really the person who approached hoodoo conjure as a scientist. She was not only an extraordinary novelist, playwright, ethnographer, but she collected most of what we know in the 20th century comes through Zora Neale Hurston. I put up some of the material that comes from her Mules and Men. Again, a wonderful, wonderful book. But Hurston tells us that many of the traditions that we looked at did survive past slavery. And not only did they survive, in her collection of folklore writings, she's providing information on some of the rare uses of organic substances, roots and herbs, and so forth. And then something that is associated with what we call the local healing tradition, creating charms. And charms, again, this is something we can talk about later. These were called by many different names. You've heard the word mojo charms. You've heard the word possibly gree-gree, tobies, goofers, sometimes just luck and so forth. But these are material that is created by a root doctor, by the local healer, by the conjurer, that one can carry on one's person. These charmed objects were said to ward off misfortune, physical and otherwise, or conversely, you can bring misfortune to others. So these local healers were often very busy. And I post this image here because I really believe that the research and the history that is done on hoodoo conjure has to be done at the local level. All right. These are images of local conjurers in different parts of the country. Some of them are well known, some of them aren't well known. Okay. But in order to recover these histories, which is really what we want to do, one has to go local. It's very, very hard to generalize about this. All right. But one of the things that is interesting after emancipation, the traditions of hoodoo conjure become more commodified. And what I mean by that is that as people leave the South and as people move into the urban settings, they bring their traditions with them. And so there's a certain point, and I would say this is maybe within the first decade or so of the 20th century, where hoodoo becomes part of a commodity system. It becomes part of business. It changes for the most part, but you can see here, these are some examples of catalogs in the 20th century where you can actually buy the herbs where maybe a generation before they were just, they were grown, or you could go into your own backyard. So this is one of the things that I point to where I say that hoodoo conjure is a very local thing. With the opening up of hoodoo tradition, the commodification and the commercialization of the tradition, it becomes more universal in some sense. So, like right now, we can buy herbs from all over the world. This was really the first time when you could buy the roots that were used for these traditions through mail order, mainly in the early 20th century. All right. So I've skipped over a little bit here because I want to wrap it up. And we can get into details. One of the things that I really find, again, so interesting about these traditions is how they're being recovered or reclaimed by members of the African American community even now. We need to know more. We need to know more because there are so many gaps in our knowledge. For many African American people, though, it is clear that the role of the healer is understood as a sacred role, even a religious role. Okay, so I don't believe you can really get at the essence of this tradition without a grasp of the spiritual and the sacred aspects. I mean, one can, and there have been some tremendously good studies of hoodoo conjure, but there's something about this. It's this legacy that's been carried forward in time. The understanding that hoodoo is something, and the hoodoo practitioner, it's a sacred office. It is like Du Bois said. The hoodoo practitioner, or what he called the voodoo practitioner, had this extraordinary role within the community. And this is this legacy that I think is being carried forward. The extent to which these practices continue today is a point of debate and discussion. So we're not sure whether people who practice these traditions today are doing it the same way that their ancestors did. We don't know. A lot of times there's a chain of learning that's been broken, all right? But what we do know is that this distinctive spiritual focus and ritual knowledge of the Black hoodoo conjurer, practitioner, and root worker still remains strong. And so we continue to recover these stories and histories so as to learn more and to reclaim our community histories. And in so doing, we honor our own ancestors as well as the ancestral traditions that are central to African American culture. Thank you. And I'm going to.
All right. So do you want to open things up to a Q&A, Dr. Chireau?
Okay.
I think we have a question in the chat from Sharon. Can you elaborate on the idea of voodoo, look within or inner gaze, per Michael and Bellegarde Smith, and voodoo in Haitian life and culture, invisible powers?
Okay, I didn't get the last part. You said elaborate.
Oh, okay.
Just repeat it. I'm having, it's breaking up.
Sure. It said per Michelle and Bellegarde Smith, and voodoo in Haitian life and culture, invisible powers.
Okay, another wonderful book. And again, if you're interested in books, as I am, please contact me at academichoodoo.com. I'm always willing to share books. So the question I think has to do with Haitian Vodou versus African or West African Nigerian voodoo. All right, and as I said, the word voodoo, V-O-O-D-O-O, has become something of a junk term. I think the questioner is asking about a wonderful book by two scholars, Haitian scholars, who look at the indigenous religion in Haiti, okay? And so in Haiti, I'm not gonna say it's worse because slavery is awful, but what's distinctive about Haiti and Haiti slavery is that it is the only place in the Western Hemisphere where slaves came together, rose up, and took their freedom by force. So it is the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, something that should be celebrated. Part of the reason, part of the impetus for that revolution, because it was a revolution like we had here, was the religion of Haitian, or what's called Haitian Vodou. Vodou is a term that I think comes again from the outside because practitioners don't use it. It later becomes voodoo by observers. The idea that a religion that brings together Africans, as I said, African people coming from all over the continent. In Haiti, they joined together, as did Black Americans in the United States, they joined together. But what's extraordinary here is that in Haiti, religion was the glue that bound them together in their uprising. In the United States, as we know, by the second generation, many Black Americans were Christianized, all right? Or they had no religion, like Douglass says. They have a religion that we don't know a name. So in Haiti, Vodou is certainly, it's a powerful religion. Some even say that, well, it's a state religion. Very different from what happens in the United States. So that book really tells us more about the history and the ethos of Haitian Vodou. Now in West Africa, today, if you go to places like Togo or Nigeria or Benin, formerly Dahomey, there is a religion, a state religion, a national religion that is called voodoo. And I know this is really confusing because, you know, the orthography is not consistent, right? But in Africa today, there is a religion of voodoo, and it is considered to be the root tradition of the Africans who were brought to the various colonies. So there's a lot going on here. What I was trying to get at, though, is how this term voodoo has become sort of an all-purpose term to talk about, and VOODO, to talk about Black spiritual alterity, or to talk about, you know, something that is you know, the voodoo economics, something that is impossible or magical. It's a very derogatory and negative notion that I've seen applied outside of the religious context. And so we're better off not using it. There is an argument that in New Orleans, there is a particular kind of religion that is associated with voodoo, but even there, this is something that we need to know more about. Okay, so is that helpful? Excellent book, by the way. If you can post that in the chat, there's so many great books out there. Thank you for that question. This is good.
All right, we have another question. My daughter is 15. She wants to know, do you think that there is a correlation between hoodoo and the modern day fad of crystal use and tarot cards that I see on TikTok and other places on social media? Yeah. This has been an ongoing conversation in our home, by the way.
Yes, and this is why I really want to see more people. And I don't necessarily think you have to be a professional historian. This is something that we want to know more about for ourselves. I've observed hoodoo talk in some of the online communities, and I noticed that they're very eclectic, as you say. They incorporate, you know, some people do tarot, some people incorporate Reiki. You know, it seems like there's a free for all. I think that's actually normal, because one of the things that we see in the enslaved community is that, not that it's a free for all, but that people are drawing upon what's available. So as I said, enslaved Black people, they knew Native American herbalism because they learned it. So they're drawing from that tradition. They're drawing from the Anglo tradition as well. So you know, it looks from the outside that it's just a big mess, but there's something very consistent about it. And that's the orientation. Is it good for human well-being and flourishing? Is it good for supporting the African-American slave? Now, this is where I kind of differ from the contemporary practitioners. The tradition in slavery was very, very, very different in that, and I always have to be careful here. You know, we're not enslaved. Black folk are not enslaved now. Sometimes it feels like we're going backwards, but we have the ownership of the body. And I showed you that runaway advertisement because there's nothing more stark than that. If the law says that you do not have ownership of your body, okay, and I know, you know, nowadays it feels like we don't, but it simply isn't that way now. What can you do for yourself? What is your perception of what healing is for yourself? So the notions of healing, and this is what I was getting at, and I might have rushed through it. The notions of healing and affliction and wellness are constrained by slavery and the institution of slavery, all right? And so it demands different things. Today, we're free. We're free to pick crystals if we want. We're free to buy our herbs from over the sea if we need to. One of the things that I emphasize, though, is that I think that spiritual element, the spiritual orientation is still present. So even on the hoodoo talk and the Instagram hoodoo practitioners, one of the things I noticed that I think is a wonderful thing, that circle of culture, there's always a call for the ancestors. So if you have ancestors, and if you have enslaved ancestors, or if you have Black ancestors, that there's sort of like a natural lineage, okay, that you can draw upon. So that's certainly part of it. I think that is where you find the spiritual element in contemporary hoodoo practices. But this is the thing, you know, everybody has ancestors. You know, maybe your ancestor wasn't a hoodoo practitioner. Maybe they were one of those domestic healers, those doctors there's a lot of Irish folk medicine at the time. Maybe so everyone has this, and everyone has access to their lineage, and so that's what I really want to see more of as people research their own ancestry. They see where these traditions may fit in there. All right, and sometimes you'll be surprised. That's an excellent question. I love to put my students on projects like this because, you know, young people are so internet savvy and they know, you know, everything else. But this is one of the areas, contemporary practices of Hoodoo conjure, that we really want to know more about. I'm still stuck in the slavery era. I'm still gathering material, especially from that early period where we don't know enough about it. We know a lot about, you know, antebellum period, but I really, really want to know more about that early period. So I'm always encouraging my students and other people to see what's going on out in the world. So this is a good question, and I hope you can do more research in you know, in your house too. Good question. Thank you.
With another question from James, are you able to speak to the American Indians who are misclassified as free people of color who practice Hoodoo from American Indian origins?
Okay, I think, and for some reason it goes in and out. I think you're asking about American Indians who practiced Hoodoo. Is that just repeat it? For some reason your voice goes in and out. Just repeat the question because I want.
Sorry, maybe this would be clearer.
It's fine.
Are you able to speak to the American Indians who were misclassified as free people of color who practice Hoodoo from American Indian origins?
Yeah, that is such a wonderful. I can't speak to it, but I can direct you to someone who's done a lot more research than anyone else. And it's an important topic, and I'm not trying to blow you off. Michelle Lee has a book called Working the Root, and she goes and she interviews some of the elders who are root workers, and she goes all over the country. What I find fascinating is that I would say a quarter, if not half of the people in that book, they are people of color, but they're Native Americans. So sort of this racial conflation that goes on at an early point. I know it's there. There needs to be a lot more research done on it, but that too is very regional. You do certainly find in the documents that I've looked at, you find in some African-American and enslaved communities, you find real fluid interactions with Native American people that continue even after the Civil War with the Black colleges. In other places you don't find, and I'm thinking places like New England, which you have conjurers in New England, you had slavery there, but you don't find these sorts of interactions. So I'm always giving long answers. I could just say it a short way. Michelle Lee is a great place to start, but the research has to be local. So instead of making a generalization about, which I won't do, about Native American people and African American people and how they're classified, one needs to go to the place. And so her book is a great resource for looking at Hoodoo and root workers. And one of the things I love about it is the recipes, the cross section of healing herbs, and because it's all environment, because some herbs you'll find somewhere and you won't find them. The cross section of Black American traditions and Native American traditions. So she really captures that. The book is called, I think I'm getting it wrong, and someone can Google it quickly, Working the Root, and her name is Michelle Lee. It's a wonderful illustrated book, and I try to tell everyone about it. Okay. Hope that's helpful.
We've got a question from Nick. With the increased cost of medical care and insurance, do you see Hoodoo coming back as a viable public health option in poor Black communities?
Wow, that's a good question. I think it's always been there. I think that every neighborhood, you know, Black, white, and other, they have their herbalists, they have their herbal specialists. I think what you're asking me though speaks more to the status of the healing practitioner, the healer, whether there will be community members who have that kind of authority that we saw during the slavery period. I don't know. Yeah, health and healing and well-being in this country is so fraught with, you know, so many things. You know, if it was to come back, the question would be, well, is healing commodified as it was in the early 20th century, or is healing sort of like a ministry like some of these enslaved people saw it. You paid in kind. You didn't charge X, Y, and Z as you did in a later period. So that's a tough one. I'm going to be pessimistic and say no, but I will say that in many Black churches today, there are people who are healers and they're called to heal. They might use herbs, but they're more likely to lay on their hands like a Reiki practitioner would. So there is a thriving tradition of healing in Black churches. They're not going to call it hoodoo, of course, because hoodoo is like voodoo, and that's the stuff that those other people do. So it's there. The herbal part, I don't know. It's a good question. I do see that many young people, and myself included, and I'm not that young, are turning back to natural remedies because they're viable, they work. But as far as the institution, that there is one person in the community that's responsible or that you can come to, I don't know if we would see that. And if we saw that, they would probably get in trouble with the government or something because, there's a public health system. So it's a good question. But I'm actually more pessimistic about that, given what we've seen in the past couple of years about, the state of public health and addressing some of the crises that are going on. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Good questions. These are excellent questions. I really, really do enjoy this.
Okay, the next question we have is, do you know any specifics around how groups of African tribes brought to varying areas and localities in the US influenced hoodoo and healing traditions regionally?
You're asking about the different, I won't say tribes, but the different nations and ethnic groups that influenced healing hoodoo locally. Yes. And Michael Gomez has written a really cool book about this that talks about how the different nationalities and ethnic groups, how they might have been, I'll just pick South Carolina for a good example, because that had a majority of black enslaved Black people in the colonial period, how they are bringing their traditions and they become really localized. Yes. It's really, really cool place if you want to look at this more is in New Orleans, because New Orleans really becomes, New Orleans is like, I think, the second largest port for slaves, right? In what became the United States. So you have people coming in from different groups, different nations and so forth. So New Orleans is where you'll find it. You'll find this ethnicity. But the other place that you'll find it is in South Carolina. The border, there are these barrier islands called the Sea Islands, right off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. And this was where you had illegal slave trade after 1808. You have Africans coming in there. So two places where you'll find the answer to your question, other than Michael Gomez's book, and I can't remember the name of it. If you give me a second, I'll remember it. Two places, New Orleans and the Sea Islands off of South Carolina and Georgia. You will find the concentration of African cultures that influence the kind of hoodoo and conjure that emerged there. They're often very different from what you'll find in some place like Connecticut, where I also find conjure, or even in a place like Maryland, where Frederick Douglass was. I think that answers your question. But Michael Gomez, I really love his book. I have the title. It's called Exchanging Our Country Marks. He's referring to the marks of the country that are carved on the face. And he goes deeply into the different nations and ethnic groups and how they informed African-American traditions and practices. Michael Gomez. I might have gotten the name wrong, but the title wrong, but I think it's called Exchanging Our Country Marks. Yeah, good. As you can tell, this is an area that there's such a need for more research and understanding. And again, it's not just for college people, even researching your own family lineage. You'd really be surprised. Yes, someone wrote that. Thank you, Joy. Hi, Joy. It's good to see you. Exchanging our country, your country marks. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Do we have any other questions? If you want to put them in the chat, I can read them out loud for Dr. Chireau.
A lot of good questions in here. It's good.
Yes, I've tried to keep up posting some links to WorldCat so people can find in their local library where these books are located.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I'm looking at the chat here, and you know, there's so many great conversations about this material. I approach this more as a historian. I find that there's often a hunger to learn how to do conjure or how to do root working, and you know, and that's great. That's where we are. But I really feel that we need to recover and to reclaim those ancestors that have been lost, like Long Hercules, like people who didn't have a chance to write it down, but their presence is made known in different ways. To me, that's a sacred work, because by remembering the dead, right? Whether it's your family member, your great, or someone like Long Hercules, you are bringing them back in a way. And I think that that's one of the, you know, that's one of the roles that we have as, you know, as not only as historians, but as family members, to recover our ancestors, what they did, what they said, and bring it into the present. So I'm you know, it's great to want to learn more about how to do these traditions, or to want to sit at the feet of a person, a conjure woman, or to me, there's not a greater calling than recovering your own ancestors and the wisdom that's in your own lineage, and actually being surprised at what you find. I'll just say this as an aside. My husband got one of those memberships with ancestry.com. And I mean, they're great, but you know, once you start, you got to keep paying for it. But one of the things you find is that there's a real desire in the world today to bring the past into the present. And one of the best ways to do that is to draw upon your own lineage. I am not saying that if you're not a descendant of slaves, you can't practice conjure or root working. I'm not saying that, although there are people who say that. But what I'm saying is that there's not a greater calling than to sort of elevate your own lineage in this way, to find out about the past. I mean, and there's all kinds of surprises there. So, I mean, who knows? You could have a conjurer or a hoodoo person in your past that you don't even know about. So that's what I encourage you. I see a number of questions here. Okay. There's a great conversation going on over here in the side, so I really do like this.
So the next question I had lined up was, how does hoodoo impact the Christian faith?
Oh yes, that's one of my favorite issues, or it was. Today or then. I'll speak to the then, because I'm much more comfortable in the dusty archives than I am on the internets today. So as I said, when this tradition began, there really wasn't a Christian church per se. Most Black folk did not, and this is a fun fact, right? Most Black folk did not become Christian until after emancipation. So you did have some converts, you had some churchgoers, but by and large, what we're looking at is what Rabbitoh called the invisible institution. This is the religion that Douglass said had no name. So, and slavery is how many hundreds of years? So for hundreds of years, you have Black folk who are practicing something. We know from people like the wonderful Sterling Stuckey that part of what they did involved a circle of culture. Usually it's a dance or a movement. It involves the circle, and the circle becomes a vital symbol in the Afro-Atlantic world. It becomes a symbol of the cosmos. It becomes a symbol for the travel of the soul in many lifetimes. This is belief in the sort of transmigration, the circle. So there's a lot of religious stuff going on in slave communities involving a circle. Now, when those folk do convert to Christianity, they carry these sorts of traditions, their circle dances, they called them the ring shouts, into Christianity. So at a certain point, a lot of it converges. After emancipation is where you begin to get a lot of trouble, I think. And I wrote about this in my book, because it's after emancipation, of course, when Black folk are free to create their own churches. They don't have to do it under the slave owner's watch. So will these churches be like white churches? Will these churches have the African elements? Will these churches allow conjure and so forth? So there's a big conversation going on as to what African-American life would be like. And just to make the long story short, I've written about this too, that there's sort of for lack of a better word, a respectability politics that's going on with the Black churches. And as you would expect, the Black churches were the first singular Black-owned institution, apart from the Masons, who we also don't hear that much about. This was where Black people could practice, could do, they could learn, they could organize. It was theirs. It was something that they owned for themselves. What kind of church would it be? Would it be a church that's respectable, a church filled with literate people, a church filled with people who are Christians and no longer Africans? So all these debates are going on at the time, I would say, really, really right after emancipation, as well as all the other things that are going on. What I do find, and again, to make a long story short, and this has got me into a little trouble with some of my academic peers, maybe even some of you who are here. I argue that even though on the surface, a lot of these practices were seen as not respectable or reminiscent of the slavery days, the old ways that people were trying to get rid of, they sort of sneak into the church in different ways. And so I would argue that some of the traditions, some of the practices of hoodoo and conjure even go undercover, all right? And they reappear in the early 20th century. And this is where I get into trouble. I'm not going to say too much more, but I think that a lot of the Pentecostal movement, you all may know about the Pentecostal movement, was a worldwide movement, began in 1906. A lot of the Black, and it was a Black movement and its origins. A lot of the Pentecostals, the holiness practitioners, the churches of the so-called lower class, those people are reluctant to give up the stuff that works. So you do find in some cases things that look like conjure. They would never say it's conjure or hoodoo or voodoo, but begin to seep into those churches, which ironically, those Pentecostal holiness, revival churches of the lower classes, they're the ones who are really doing the kind of healing practices. The respectable churches, they hold on to some things, but they're not doing this sort of supernatural, I would call it supernatural or spiritual healing. So that to me is a great question. I don't think it's as controversial as I'm making it sound, but yes, conjure and Christianity at an early point, they come together and you can't pull them apart, even if you call them something different. And just another shout out to New Orleans. New Orleans provides us with many cases of where conjure, rootworking, hoodoo are sort of re-signified by the churches. And in New Orleans, it's even more interesting because it's Catholicism and not in the Catholic Church and not the Protestant churches as it was elsewhere. That was a long answer, but yes. And in my book, in the Black Magic book, I talk a little bit about conjuring Christianity. Okay.
All right. For our next question, there'll be a little bit of overlap here. How do young women of color begin in learning about hoodoo? How do you feel about this? One's the part where there's some overlap. How do you feel about voodoo and Christianity? So maybe you kind of already addressed that part of the question.
How do I feel about voodoo and Christianity?
How do you feel about voodoo and Christianity? Is it possible to do both?
I think you talk to people who do both, and they would say absolutely. Now there are some people that some of my peers who I respect and love would say no, they're not compatible. And in fact, one is, I'm not going to say they say it's of the devil, but it's this idea that you have basically Africanized magic, and then you have Christianity, and it's sort of this idea that religions are pure and they should be kept apart, which may or may not be true. Again, the sources, all I have to go with from that time are the sources, and the sources tell me they were not only compatible, but people were very pragmatic. So yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm in trouble. I'm being, there's affliction. I'm being beaten, like young Frederick Douglass. What can I do besides pray? Okay, and so people adapt what they do. Now, I'm not saying that it's seamless, and there's lots of stories, and I've probably written about this elsewhere, where people will adopt hoodoo conjure as Christians and feel a tremendous guilt and then get rid of it. So I think the point is that there's a lot of different things going on here, particularly when we talk about religion. So they're not all Christian, they're not all hoodoo, they're not all Muslim, but we don't even know enough about that. So that's why I actually prefer to look at this, to dig what I can from the past. In the present day, I feel like, with the internet, everything goes. I really do. But my beloved scholar friend, Katrina Hazard-Donald, says, if you want to find the hoodoo practitioner, if you want to find the expert and the adept, you go to the church. It's the church, the elders, the mothers, that's where you're going to find it. But it's not the sort of thing that you can just walk into the church and say, hey, teach me what I need. So that's what I was getting at about cultivating ancestral relationships first, right? Your family lineage, and then your community. Now it's a little harder, of course, because Black folk have moved around a lot. Sometimes it's hard but studying hoodoo conjure locally, that's how you do it. I love what young people are doing. I love their creativity. I love there's a vibrant artistic movement that's a part of this, but it's not the same as the tradition of the enslaved Black folk. There's a line there, but it's not the same. And that is because enslavement had so much to do with how people saw themselves and who they were in the world, and even their notions of affliction in the body. So it's not the same. So the practice isn't going to address the same things, although, Black folk are still oppressed. So the question for me is, and this is what I would ask young people who are practitioners or aspiring, what kinds of needs do Black Americans have today that are the same or very much like it was for enslaved African and African American people? And that's something you really have to think about. You really have to think about that. Are you free? Are you free now? Are you not? So I keep meandering around the question, but I think, yes, I think that there are many people, there are many communities, there are online communities. You don't even have to leave your house. You don't have to go out in the yard. But I also do know some people who are practitioners who are trying to bring back the old ways, as I alluded. So they will look for the local plants and the local spirits of the plants. And I again, if you write me, I can give you some names. But it's something that I think everyone has access to because everyone has ancestors. But the particular path that you want or that you're leaning for, you're gonna have to do some historical work. You're gonna have to do some uncovering of the sources. On the other hand, from what I see online, people just make things up. They put it out there. That's what religion does too. You make it up as you go along. I know I feel that it's all good. I feel that it's all good. The objection that I've gotten some emails about this is that, oh, are you saying that it's okay to say anything is hoodoo? I'm not saying that it's okay, but I'm saying that's where it is now. That's where it is now. I don't like it when people fight over religions. I don't like religious conflict. But I also think that these traditions are big enough, and certainly because they're derived from African orientations, they're flexible. So they can draw in a lot, all right? So, and because there's no pope, there's no hierarchy of hoodoo, there's no one policing it and saying, no, you can't. And that's a good thing. And for others, it might be, not so much of a good thing. Did that answer your question? Okay.
For our next question, we have I am an Indigenous American Haitian woman learning about my lineage. I find a lot of dead ends when I'm looking for my lineage in Haiti. How do you intersect hoodoo and voodoo? What do you recommend to help move through the fear that people instill in you about learning about voodoo?
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, bless you. Bless you. You're an Indigenous American Haitian woman, then you have a stellar lineage. Yeah, you'll find a lot of dead ends because for lots of reasons, right? So, I shared some information tonight about Haiti, being unique, except real exceptionalism, not the fake American, but this history of Haiti, Haitian independence, and the role of Vodou, the religion, has sort of been hidden. It's sort of an occult. It's a cult thing. Fortunately, we do have scholars that are working toward this. I can't make a recommendation to you personally, but it sounds like you know where to look for this. As far as the intersection with hoodoo, um, I think that Vodou and Haitian religion, which has again this tremendous I was going to say staying power, but there is a heritage, there is a culture that's been retained in a more pristine way than hoodoo practitioners have. I think that's what you need. Now, how you intersect hoodoo and voodoo, there's a lot of voodoo, there's a lot of intersection, but why would you? As far as I can tell, you can go to Haiti and get everything and more, or you can talk to Haitian people and get everything and more about hoodoo. Hoodoo, because of the nature of American slavery, has become really fragmented. So you actually probably have access to much more information. Now about the fear, that's something that, again, I tried to talk about that early on. We don't even want to use words like voodoo because they're junk words, they're sort of lazy words. So the fear, I have a lot to say about that, and I'm actually trying to write a piece on that. I think the fear, this is going to sound strange, I think the fear of Haiti and Vodou in particular is more psychic. I think it's really, really deeply embedded in the Western consciousness, and because of that singular event. You imagine it, we hear about all the revolutions in the world, the French Revolution, the Great American Revolution. It's a revolution of Black people, and this religion was one of the impetus for that revolution. This is something we should be learning about every day. I mean, yeah. So to answer your question in a short way, you move through the fear by information, right? Right. So you get this information. It's no longer hidden and occult, and no one talks about it, and no one knows about Haiti except what they see on the TV. All right. You do the historical work, and that's my thing. And then you worry about the contemporary understanding. And this is one of the things I think, I mean, everyone can probably agree with me. This is going on today. There's really sort of a rethinking of America and what it means to be American and so forth, and the role of American, in particular Black Americans, right? So the argument is that no, Black American people, it's not so much that Black folk are marginal and oppressed, but they're actually the center. They are in some ways the I'm not going to say the real Americans, but they're at the center of what it means to be American. And we keep seeing this again and again. So it's like, and then there'll be a great book or two, and then there'll be a pushback. But that's how you deal with the fear. Just more information and more truth. I think that the truth is the disinfectant. And I'm not as pessimistic as many of my intellectual and academic peers, because, and as I keep saying this, you guys, you can go back into your own story and find inspiration. And I see some really great conversations here, and some good quotes. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm reading one of these things. So the resources, the historical resources, again, we have our public libraries. It's not that, you don't have to be rich to use the library. This is why I'm all about supporting our public libraries and the information that's there. I think that information and gathering the information is the best way to sort of challenge the fear about this. you know. Thank you for that question. That was a good question. I see one question. I'm just going to take it on quickly. What do you think about the reliability of Hyatt's work in understanding the history of Hoodoo? I see we have some insiders here. So Hyatt, Harry Middleton Hyatt was he was an Episcopal minister, a liberal Episcopalian who traveled the country in the early 20th century gathering Hoodoo stories. Now, he gathered them in a very raw form. He would take, you know, like the recordings, and it was very different from Zora Neale Hurston, who did more of an analytical, you would call Hurston, as someone who collects Hoodoo stories, sort of the participant observer. And there's lots of evidence that she was an initiate. Hyatt was a liberal minister. He would go to Black communities, he would go to white communities, all over the place. You know, I think most of his work he did in Illinois, and he would gather these verbatim. So, you know, and you know, they typed them out. There's like thousands of pages of this stuff. I think that it is a valuable collection. It is a snapshot in time. But some of the controversy about Hyatt is that, like many like many observers or ethnographers, they go into Black communities and they think that they're getting the truth. They think that so people would tell stories to him, they would make stuff up. And the funny thing is, Zora Neale Hurston talks about this. She doesn't talk about Hyatt. She says, you can't just go in to talk to people because they're gonna lie. And then she goes and she says, what lying is in Black culture is not really a lie. So again, long answer. I'll give you the short answer. Hyatt's work is reliable in that it provides you a snapshot of information that he is getting in the moment from different people. All right. Now, I know some of my friends, they go to that and they treat it like a spell book. So it's a grimoire. So it's a very, very detailed book, a collection. It tells you, I had a slide up here that gives you some of the formulas from Hurston. So Hyatt's does that at a granular level, a local level. So this is the root you use, or this is the practice, da, 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 da. So it's reliable, but I wouldn't go and just pull something from a book and then try it out. I mean, I think, you know, a scientist would do that, you know, well, let me try this experiment. So when you say reliable, I would just say, well, reliable how? That the people were telling the truth when they talked to him, or that the stuff works, that is efficacious. But it's a wonderful collection. Again, thousands of pages. I'm really hoping someone can annotate that at some point. But yes, it's one of the rare collections that we have of the folk beliefs. I think that book, and if you could type it in so that everyone could see it, it's got a weird long title called Harry Middleton Hyatt, Witchcraft, Hoodoo, Conjuration, Rootwork. But you can double check that, and it's available. You can't buy them, 'cause it's like, I mean, you can if you spend a lot of money, but most of that material is available online. Okay,
all right.
Good question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chireau. I think we're gonna wrap up now, but I want to thank you for a fantastic lecture and for all those great answers to those questions, and for everyone who attended and asked such great questions too. I'm just going to put a link really quick in our chat for our program next week. We've got a new series, Artist Talks, and our first guest is going to be Vernon Byron, the multimedia artist who created the mural of Frederick Douglass, who Dr. Chireau mentioned earlier, on the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of Frederick Douglass to Newburgh. So the link for that program is in our chat. And thank you again to everyone. And just a reminder that this recording will be made available on our YouTube channel and on Facebook. Thank you again so much, and I hope everyone has a really great night. Take care, everyone.